Thank you for joining us on Heritage Events Live. We're delighted to welcome you to our policy polls on enhancing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Please welcome our speakers, Patty Jane Geller, Policy Analyst in Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense, and Brett Sadler, Senior Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our event on enhancing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. I'm Patty Jane Geller, a nuclear deterrence analyst here, joined by my colleague Brent Sadler, who's our Senior Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology. And so today we're going to be talking about the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which was established by Congress last year to consolidate and rebalance our investments in the Indo-Pacific. And we're also going to focus a bit on defense of Guam in particular. I recently wrote a paper on the topic that I believe you should be able to access during the chat, and I think Brent has some commentary that we'll be posting on the topic as well. So we have 30 minutes today, so we're going to jump right into it. Brent, if you would start us off, if you can give us some background on the PDI, what it is, what we're looking at with Guam.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, PJ. Yeah, a couple of things. First off, on Guam. For those that may not be as familiar with the geography or how Guam fits into the operational and the economic landscape in the Western Pacific, it really is a hub, both militarily and economically, in the Western Pacific. It sits right about a little under 3,000 miles from all of the hot spots in the East Asian theater. Another part that's important to reiterate about Guam is it is also close enough to a lot of our partners in the region, like Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and Malaysia, that also visit with their military forces as well as conduct operations and exercises with our forces there. It's not right in the thick of things in the South and the East China Sea. It's far enough away where they can actually practice more sensitive operations and exercises. And that's an important point because it's also a hub for our partners in the region, which is a key element of the National Defense Strategy. The other thing, just to reiterate, and it can get lost because it is on the other side of the date line, that actually Guam is homeland USA. And there's about 168,000 US citizens that live there. So the defense of Guam is also an imperative for US citizens' security and safety. As far as Patty Jane was mentioning about the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, PDI, this is, I would say, an ongoing effort. It's about 10 years. It started back, some of you may recall, the Defense Strategic Guidance, the DSG, otherwise known as the Rebalance to Asia Pacific. So many of these initiatives, needs, and desires, posture, presence, and operations, exercises particularly, they go back 10 years in the operational design and the planning for Indo-Pacific Command. So it's not necessarily anything new, but what is new is a re-energized effort on the part of Congress to enable and to fund. And in this case, what we've seen is the Senate's actually willing to go above the president's proposed budget and basically elevate the top line. And this is a key thing because even with the rebalance, when I was at PACOM and we were trying to get additional funds to rebalance our forces, it's the services, it's the Air Force, the Army, Marine Corps, and the Navy that actually pay that bill. And it usually comes out of their budget that's already programmed. And that's what you saw, and that's why there was so much angst on this year's proposal. A vast majority of the $5.1 billion that the president proposed actually is an acquisition. An acquisition is nothing that what Indo-PACOM was requesting. It's very, very small. About $300 million of what's in that acquisition actually answers what Indo-PACOM was seeking. So the important thing on that, the lesson to take is the services actually pay this bill. So if you're going to move money to a deterrence initiative like PDI, it has to be on top of what's being programmed by the services because they're the ones that actually manage it. A couple other points of this. When the budget came forward this year, there was a line of accounting for logistics and enablers. So this is information operations as well as intelligence. That entire line item was removed from the president's proposed budget. And this is a key thing which I hope we'll see get put back in, and that $700 million that's being considered on top for addressing unfunded requests from Indo-PACOM. I think that's pretty much about it on the PDI. There's some historical we can kind of reflect on later, but I turn it back over to you, PJ.
Hey, can I just ask you one follow-up
Yeah.
question? This logistics and enablers line, why is that important to prioritize in the PDI as opposed to kind of the more acquisition stuff that we saw in the budget?
Well, a couple of things. So first, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, the acquisition is not appropriate for something from Indo-PACOM. That's something that should be programmed in the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army's budgets, their top line.
Not the PDI itself.
Not the PDI. And the PDI is a nearer-term deterrence, and it's informed by the operational plans. And while the overall force structure, the man, train, and equip mission of like the Navy and the Army are a part of that, really what Admiral Davidson and what Indo-PACOM and before it Admiral Harris, it goes back 3 commanders, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get that forward presence, that forward posture. And in order to do that better, you need to have better information that you can also share with your partners in the region, your allies. And there are a couple of items in this line item, the logistics and the enablers, and I stress the enablers, that actually are very, very key to having your forces move in that first island chain. This is the Philippines and as well the southern Ryukyu Islands in Japan and Malaysia for that matter. If you're going to operate and be in there, you have to understand what you're dealing with out on the sea and in the air and below the sea. And these enablers are key to that.
Great. So I think that gives me a good segue to turn back to Guam for a bit. You know, we're in great power competition. We're trying to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific and work on this PDI because of the Chinese threat that we all know is growing. We've heard our commanders say that we don't know when China is going to decide when it's time to go ahead and take back Taiwan. And the question is the United States ready? And as you discussed, Guam is of strategic importance in any conflict with China. But what I want to talk about is how Guam is becoming increasingly threatened and the importance of developing this advanced missile defense system on Guam that was part of the original PDI request or included in the PDI last year. We know that China is advancing its regional capabilities. Its DF-26 ballistic missile can strike Guam with precision. DF-17 can also range Guam and maybe carry a hypersonic weapon. Its cruise missile capability is advancing, and most, if not all, of its missiles in the region can also carry nuclear weapons. Admiral Richard actually said that China can employ nearly any nuclear strategy that it wants to in the region, which gives it the ability to backstop its conventional forces in a conflict. So I think for these reasons, which is why Admiral Davidson, the previous Indo-PACOM commander, has been saying that Guam is no longer a place to just fight from, but also we're going to need to fight for it. And not only because we have these 170,000 citizens on Guam, I'm glad you drove in that point about how it's U.S. homeland, but the strategic location as well. It's far enough away from China's arsenal of short-range missiles, but close enough to be able to provide logistical support. Goes back to your logistics and enablers point earlier. So I think it's for these reasons that an advanced missile defense on Guam has actually been on the Indo-PACOM's unfunded priorities list for the last 3 years. In particular, so Admiral Davidson and then now Admiral Aquilino has requested a persistent, permanent 360-degree missile defense capability on Guam that can respond to any ballistic or cruise missile. Last year, the SASC, the Senate Armed Services Committee, finally got the ball rolling here, or tried to in their NDAA by adding in about $77 million into the first PDI for land-based SM-3 interceptors on Guam. They knew that we would need at least those advanced interceptors. But I guess the House didn't want that money, so we ended up with a bill that just required further study on Guam. What kind of missile defense should we put in there? Even though we have been hearing about it from Indo-PACOM for a few years now. And this year's budget kind of does the same thing. It requests $118 million for Guam, but that's not even half of what was in Indo-PACOM's original request that we got this spring, the Section 1251 report, which was closer to, I think it was $350 million. And neither does the budget actually commit to what kind of system that we're going to develop on Guam for missile defense. there was $40 million in procurement request for general parts that could apply to any defense system, but nothing specific. And it's for that reason that the House Appropriations Committee didn't give that $40 million in procurement funding. I'll explain later that I think we should get that $350 million in, but I think it makes sense that the House didn't want to fund something that was undefined. And so the reason that moving forward with Guam defense is so important is not just because time is of the essence for defending Guam. Admiral Davidson has said that China might try to change the status quo in the region within the next 6 years, and Admiral Aquilino said the threat is closer than we think. So that's why I think we need to get moving. And it's not just about protecting U.S. forces and people, it's also about deterrence. If we have missile defense on Guam, China might think twice before deciding to attack, because missile defense can help convince China that their attack will fail. Even if maybe they can penetrate our missile defense systems, doing so would require depleting their offensive forces. So I think it's an important capability. I'll want to talk about later, what exactly we should build, but you've told me that you've had some ideas about some things we can do it now in the short term.
Oh yeah, so the defense of Guam from a ballistic missile and cruise missile threat, it's only been growing, but it's been around for well over a decade. And so from my time at PACOM back in 2012 to 15, we actually looked at this, and there actually are proposals that are there that are approved that just needs to get moved forward. And to quote Admiral Harris, is get on with it. So his article in Breaking Defense earlier in July 9th really kind of makes the case. He's really talking about Aegis Ashore as one of the options, and there's a requirement for one emplacement of Aegis Ashore in Guam. And he rightfully addresses a concern with Aegis Ashore, and that is it able to integrate the THAAD battery that's there on Guam, as well as with air operations, maybe other local naval BMD assets? Can it actually coordinate? And really the name of the game for defense is integrated air and missile defense. And so all of those assets and their sensors and their munitions need to be all coordinated and considered as a whole. They have different radar horizons, they have different capabilities and fidelity. And so a couple of things I looked at in the past and things that are here right now. Again, I go back to the reason that THAAD is there was that we had a crisis with North Korea, and the THAAD battery was actually not supposed to come out of continental United States, but because of the time we were able to move it, and it didn't have all its missiles, and there it is still to this day. So from 2013, under an urgent request, an RFF, for those out there that may know that term, a request for forces, it's been there since. So if we don't get Aegis Ashore, that's takes about 3 years to build. You're going to have to need, in order to be inside this Davidson window, Admiral Davidson window, to deter China in the near term, you need something there sooner. A couple of things to consider. First, you've got 3 cruisers that are being considered for decommission that are BMD capable. Now those cruisers, you could take one and you could anchor it in Apra Harbor or off the coast of Guam, not use it as a gray hull that's hunting for submarines. It doesn't mitigate the full cost that Navy's trying to get rid of by decommissioning it next year, but at least you focus in on what's above the waterline, the sensor and the missile tubes, the VLS, 122 plus missile tubes. That's a significant asset that you could put there, you could move there in a couple weeks. And there's your temporary Aegis Ashore. The other one to consider, and this was one that was looked at also back in 2013, is you have a cruise missile threat coming from Chinese submarine ships and aircraft that's very real. And THAAD and Patriot batteries and using an Aegis Ashore to shoot down cruise missiles may not be the best use of your bullets. A better use could be a repurposing of what's known as an Army asset, CRAM, counter rocket artillery mortar. And there's that missile part, that rocket part is the key part, and that looks like the failing system that's on our ships for point defense. So why not take that out of the bunkers or out of the warehouses, repurpose it to Guam for a near-term cruise missile defense? Again, it's very close in, and you'd only turn it on when you know you've got a threat that's inbound.
Those are interesting ideas, and I didn't really know that we've been studying defense of Guam since 2013. Is that what you mentioned before? And I'm up here saying it's been 3 years that it's been on the Indo-PACOM unfunded priorities list, but I guess it's been longer. And that THAAD battery that's there now, that was meant for North Korea, not the Chinese threat.
That's right.
So it's probably not good enough for China. Is that right?
Not necessarily. It depends on the size of the threat. And again, it's not that you're going to keep Guam functional operationally throughout a saturation attack. There's going to be periods of time when the airfield or the port or the roads in between Andersen Air Force Base to the north of the island and what's known as Big Navy towards the middle of the island that are going to be, offline. But you need to have assets on island that mitigate the amount of damage that's done so that you can repair and recover quicker. So if you didn't have THAAD, how many missiles are now going to go and impact the airfield in Andersen Base? If you have it, it reduces that. But the other part of it is it does go into that the focus really should be on deterrence. The fact that you're willing to put assets on Guam, it changes the Chinese calculation, their force on force. How many missiles do they need to employ? And they're not just going to use ballistic missiles, they'll use cruise missiles as well to try to saturate and overwhelm our defenses. But they're going to have to do it periodically because there are going to be survivors, there's going to be recovery efforts, and that airfield and those roads and those ports are going to come back. So they're going to have to do it again.
So that feeds into the deterrence equation
Yes.
that missile defense provides us on Guam, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I like your idea about parking our Aegis cruisers outside of Guam. So the plan right now is to decommission those in the budget. Would this help us save any of that money that we were going to save by decommissioning, or just kind of repurpose in a way that we need?
So it wouldn't be a cost savers. It's not as much money as if you wanted to do the maintenance and the upgrades for the cruisers to keep them as cruisers, operating out at sea, hunting submarines, and doing all of those things. So you wouldn't operate them as often. You wouldn't have to have as much fuel. So there's some savings on the operational side. Again, if the plan is to eventually put an Aegis ashore in Guam, you're looking at 3 to 5 years before that's in place. So what are you going to do in those next 3 to 5 years? The priority shouldn't be on cost efficiencies. The priority should be on what tactics require, what operationally is necessary, certainly in the deterrence calculation. And so put that ship there, the priority should be how can it provide you that deterrent value until you've got these other assets online.
Great. So yeah, you mentioned this requirement for Aegis ashore, and that's been around since more than a few years,
Yes.
I guess. Is that right? Yeah. And as I kind of mentioned before, we still haven't really agreed on a system in Congress or in DoD to develop on Guam. Last year the requirement was just to study it, what kind of architecture we put on there. But yeah, I do think Admiral Davidson has specifically said Aegis ashore, and he.
Yeah, I was going to say he actually wasn't big on it because of the command and control element. And I think there's a rightful concern. It's going to take some time to work out the requirements and what specifically makes sense, because you're going to want a more distributed than what you see maybe in Romania and Poland. You're going to want to have a distributed system, Aegis ashore system in Guam. The other part of it is, while those requirements and those capabilities are coming online, you do have a command and control capacity that would be able to do that's resident on these cruisers too, the CEC. So for 3 years, or 3 to 5 years, as you're sorting out the requirements and working out the bugs in that plan for an Aegis ashore, what that should be for Guam, you've got this cruiser that's there that you could use for an interim. And again, I stress, it's an interim fix until you get something more robust and more capable.
Right. Well, yeah, so if I could dive into the kind of Aegis ashore debate, what we're actually going to develop on Guam, what's going on here. Admiral Davidson has named Aegis ashore. I think he actually testified to that in an Armed Services Committee hearing to Senator Fisher. He named explicitly Aegis ashore would deliver the capabilities that we need now and into the future. It's more advanced. It's our most advanced regional missile defense capability, right? Compared to the THAAD and Patriot batteries that would intercept a missile in their terminal phase of flight. The SM-3 interceptors especially could intercept a missile in its mid-course phase of flight, which allows for more time to intercept something as advanced as the DF-26 in China that we're dealing with today. And I think we'd also be able to plug in the SM-6, which can intercept cruise missiles, into the Aegis VLS model as well. You mentioned before what people are saying about integrated missile defense, and I know that some people think Aegis Ashore isn't sufficient for defense of Guam, and that something a little bit more complex, like a disaggregated Aegis combat system sort of architecture might be better, where we distribute sensors, shooters, and fire control across the island. And I think that makes perfect sense. I'm sure that would provide a great defense. But I think the emphasis on Aegis Ashore, at least from maybe Indo-PACOM's view, is that it's a turnkey system that we can deploy quickly while meeting Indo-PACOM's requirements. We've done Aegis Ashore before on Poland and Romania, and this one doesn't have to look totally identical, but we have that experience engineering that architecture. And I also write about in that paper that I think should be posted in the chat that the Aegis is also highly extensible. So eventually we can build Aegis Ashore and then add on to it. We can add on distributed sensors and shooters, or plug in maybe even PAC-3 interceptors or something into the VLS modules. And you kind of talked about that earlier. We have the CRAM there, at least in the short term. We can.
The CRAMs, exist. It's not being utilized. It was used in Afghanistan to protect the forward bases, operating bases. And the geography of Guam, certainly at Anderson makes sense. And down in Big Navy, depending on what the threat factors, the geography allows you to do something like that. Again, you don't want to turn these things on because it is like a failing system. And unless you know there's a cruise missile coming in, it doesn't discriminate from small fishing boats and a cruise missile necessarily.
Right.
So you want to make sure that you've got a threat inbound. So there's a downside to it. But the geography of Guam I think would be feasible for a CRAM as a cost-effective, something that exists already to get it there. Certainly a lot cheaper than a Patriot missile or an SM-6, which you want to use probably for your higher-end, more capable inbound threats. So
yeah.
You have to discriminate and also put the right missile to the right mission for the threat you mentioned, the DF-26. That's a certain hypersonics. What kind of defense are you going to use for that? But to stress, Guam's not a tiny little island. It's small, yes, but there are mountains. It is fairly large when it comes to a footprint that you're going to defend against cruise and missile defense. And so you're going to have a distributed defense pattern. You're going to have multiple places for sensors. And I mentioned Big Navy, which is Apra Harbor, which is about the middle part on the island facing towards the Philippine Sea. Anderson, which is the entire northern point of the island. So you've got 3 vectors of attack you probably have to cover. Big cliffs that just drop right into the ocean. So you're not worrying about shooting over a village or a town or something like that.
You lived on Guam, right?
Oh yeah, I grew up there, so yes.
We got some expertise here. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I know that the MDA is still studying what architecture, the final architecture to develop on Guam. And just kind of the point that I want to drive home is that MDA, them trying to figure out the exact architecture, shouldn't preclude us from moving forward with at least the starting Aegis Ashore system now. We know that we're going to need at least SM-3 interceptors on the island. The Senate tried to get the ball moving on that last year when they provided money for those interceptors. I think that's the right idea, and I think that the bottom line here is that we should be prioritizing speed over the perfect details of the architecture for now.
So one thought on this is that we've got ourselves into a situation where time is of the essence, and if I'm reading correctly, Patty Jane, on this, and that is we should do you should do the Aegis Ashore, which will take some time to get the requirements sorted out. And as you're doing that, doing the field testing, sorting out the requirements, and then actually breaking ground at the same time, you still have an urgent need today. And so this is where other creative options should be looked at. And that should not be at the expense of taking an Arleigh Burke destroyer, which does have full capability for air defense as well as anti-submarine and anti-surface warfare, and anchor it to Guam or to Japan for ballistic missile defense. Better that ship is doing all of its missions far away from land. So that also should be in the calculus, is in the near term we need to free up those ships to go do more forward deterrence and presence operations. They should not, and options that should be considered should prioritize untethering those ships and those aircraft from fixed locations like Guam and Japan so that they can be more mobile and out at sea and in air.
Yeah, that's a great point to add on, because yeah, we know there's a lot more going on in China and in the Indo-Pacific than just their missile threat to Guam, right? So yeah, this has been a great discussion. We have a few more minutes left. If you want to wrap us up, you had some thoughts earlier on just kind of the PDI in general and the history of this rebalance to the Indo-Pacific. You know, are we behind? Do we need to get moving? What's going on?
Oh, well, I certainly would echo Admiral Harris's his comments again, and is get on with it. We've studied this, and there's a term of art inside the Pentagon. It's a paralysis by analysis, and there's a wealth of analysis that's already been done on the defense of Guam. Certainly, some of the technologies and some of the sensors have been updated, but the core need and requirements are largely unchanged. So there are things that can be done that should be done, like breaking ground on some of the sensors for Guam, the emplacement of some of the batteries and building where they would operate. Those are all things that you know you have to do. So get on with what you know you're going to have to need. You know, launch platforms, sensor bases where you put these things, and then be conscious of the near term. You know, free up those destroyers so they can go do their full range of missions, while cruisers that may not be as useful, repurpose them until you've got your full battery and full sensor suite on Guam. Again, that's in a couple of years from now, but the need is here today. The other thing about the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, I just have to stress the way that the financing is done. It's the services that foot the bill. So Indo-PACOM makes a request, and unless the top lines move upwards in the same amount of what Indo-PACOM commander is asking for, the services have to then reprogram out of their man, train, and equip, which is why you saw this huge acquisition bill. The vast majority of the PDI this year was acquisitions, which was not asked.
We didn't expect that.
No. And so just to reiterate, your top line has to go up to meet their needs. And again, the services are going to provide the manpower and the assets to deliver that. But they're programming for man, train, and equip. And so by having more money that is in there, such as a line item for operations forward, geographically defined, would be very helpful for Indo-PACOM if their forward presence is what they really want to see more of. The other question is posture, you know, building infrastructure. That was a key thing. And just to reiterate, in the SAS markup, the Senate reiterated the importance that future PDI budgets must include an infrastructure element that has an emphasis on infrastructure for that forward posture west of the dateline. And that's something that's been said for over 10 years from Indo-PACOM commanders for a while. So that was just wanted to reiterate that message on Pacific Deterrence Initiative. It was a lesson learned during the rebalance, so it's not a new lesson. And again, let's not suffer from paralysis by analysis yet another year as the Chinese threat just continues to metastasize and to sharpen.
Great.
So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a great note to start wrapping up on. I love the term paralysis analysis. I think, yeah, we've been seeing that since you've been at Indo-PACOM, and I'm seeing it now with defense of Guam. We know that the China threat is real, and that we need to move forward. And I think that you're kind of getting at the Senate bill did add some money on PDI on top of that top line. I don't think we know what's in it yet until the mark gets released, but looking forward to seeing that, and hopefully Congress will make progress this year on defense of Guam and our PDI initiative to enhance deterrence in the region and defend against China.
Yes.
So we're about out of time, so we're going to wrap up here. Thanks so much, Brent. This has been a great conversation. I believe that our audience will receive a survey after the event that we'd love for you to fill out. So yeah, thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us this morning.
And if they have any questions, we'll be sure to get back to you all with responses as quick as possible. So please also send any questions.